let's continue with our discussion. We're looking at the New Testament and the Quran and the claims that come there. Again, we're looking, beginning with the initial concern with the New Testament. We'll be coming back a little later to address the question about the Quran. But because of time constraints, I might say, we've got a limited amount of time. There's a lot more material than we can cover in the brief time we have. I'm going to focus my main attention on the Greek manuscripts, the Greek text of the New Testament, with just a few remarks about the individual books or about the canon per se. First of all, regarding the individual books, where we're told that they are dubious because we don't know who wrote them or because we don't have the originals. The claim that they are dubious in that sense, that carries no weight. None whatsoever. I might say the only people that are either impressed or intimidated by that are people that really just don't understand the facts of the matter, the truth, as opposed to having the truth kind of spun in a particular way and distorted or whatever. But nobody disputes, by the way, up front, that the books are anonymous. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's not a one that identifies the author. Nobody disputes that. It's not like that's late break news or anything of that sort. But that does not mean that we do not know who wrote them or that they have no credibility. It is a logical fallacy to conclude that because they're anonymous, we don't know who wrote them, or at least can be reasonably sure who wrote them. The names attached to them were not simply pulled out of the air. There's a reason we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's a reason, and those reasons will in fact stand up to close scrutiny. Both internal and external evidence support the traditional views that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and so forth. With reference to the canon, that people simply arbitrarily met and just flipped a coin or whatever and said, this book is in, that book is out. Maybe that there's some kind of a political agenda or whatever. The fact is that there were manifestations of a New Testament canon that was evident from the very beginning. It's not like it took hundreds and hundreds of years before it was actually formed as a canon and that there was some kind of an agenda. We see evidence of this in the writings of the earliest church fathers, such as Polycarp. Polycarp was a companion and an apostle, or you might say a student of the apostle John. He wrote a letter, for example, to the church in Philippi in Greece that's interesting. It's fascinating, not the least of which is its propensity to quote from earlier Christian writings, such as the New Testament writing. Let me cite somebody, by the way. I'm going to mention this name. I'll introduce him now. I should have had a graphic with a picture. I did not at this point. But Bart Ehrman is probably the most hostile critic of the New Testament alive today. He's a man that Muslims love to quote. They love Shabir Ali and all these people. They love to quote Bart Ehrman because he had gone to a Christian school. He claimed to have been a Christian and then rejected Christianity, rejected theism. In fact, he's sort of an atheist or an agnostic, but he's a hostile critic of the New Testament. And he's written a number of books, one of which is very, very popular, misquoting Jesus. The supposition being what we have in the Gospels is not really what Jesus said. This has all been distorted. This is a misquotation. We don't really know what Jesus said, but these certainly are not the words of Jesus. But in that book, Misquoting Jesus, Bart Ehrman says, and I'm quoting, in just 14 brief chapters, Polycarp quotes more than 100 passages known from these earlier writings. Now, he's referring to this early church father, the student of the Apostle John. And he quotes more than 100 passages from the New Testament writings, asserting their authority for the situation the Philippians were facing. So he's addressing this church in a letter by quoting these sources. In one place, he appears to call Paul's letter to the Ephesians scripture. In other words, he's already acknowledging here that Paul has written a letter that is in fact scripture. It's part of the canon, in other words. More commonly, he simply quotes or alludes to earlier writings, assuming their authoritative status for the community. And I quote that because this is the guy that's the biggest critic the harshest critic, the most respected critic of the New Testament, the one, he's kind of the go-to guy for Muslim scholars who want to find something to use against Christianity that seemingly comes from within, and yet he is here acknowledging that Polycarp is, from the very beginning, quoting the New Testament, alluding to it as being Scripture. So we see from the very beginning there's already something of a canon in place. And I say that rather than creating a canon through some sort of ecclesiastical, or this just refers to the church, rather than creating a canon through ecclesiastical action, the church simply recognized what everybody already knew to be sacred Scripture. Now I want to do something before I go any further. And we're going to be looking here at the Greek text. But before we really get into that, let me discuss a phenomenon that is common. It's called a half-truth. And a half-truth is basically a lie that contains just an element of truth, just enough truth to make the lie plausible. Give you an example. We've had both a cat and a dog who in the past we've had to take to the veterinarian. They were sick. The vet gave us medicine, pills to give to the cat and the dog. They wouldn't take, neither the cat or the dog would take the pills the vet gave us. What do? We call them and say, well, it's simple. You take that pill, you put it in maybe some peanut butter, or wrap it up in a piece of cheese, or maybe get a wiener from a hot dog, just a wiener, and stick it inside the wiener and give that to them. They'll eat the cheese, the peanut butter, or the wiener. They'll not eat the pill. They don't want the pill, have nothing to do with that, but they would eat the other, not knowing at the same time that they're actually consuming the pill. That's kind of like what a half-truth is. You've got a lie. The lie is like the pill, and if you were confronted with something you knew to be a lie, you would reject it out of hand. But if you can wrap that up in maybe something that's a little more palatable, something a little more appealing, a little more attractive, like the cheese or the peanut butter or the wiener, you'll consume it. You'll take it in, hook, line, and sinker. And people believe things that are lies without ever knowing that they bought it because it's been wrapped up very attractively in something, and you might say packaged in something that is very plausible. We deal with that constantly. With Bart Ehrman, we're going to find that again and again and again, that they're going to be half-truths. They're going to be passed off as being something that's really true. There's an element of truth there. There's something about what he's saying that is true, that contains an element of truth, but there's also something that is false, and that makes it all the more insidious. Now that's what we're going to be dealing with largely, but let's look at the Greek text again. And I want to note, first of all, as we're looking at manuscripts, we are dealing with somebody that's actually written, you've got a picture of the scribe there, but the manuscripts that we possess of the New Testament, there are a lot of them. Let me begin, first of all, by explaining what a manuscript is. A manuscript is a handwritten copy. Like you've got the picture right here of the scribe. He's preparing a manuscript. He's not taking a piece of paper down to the office to the copy machine or to a mimeograph machine or the Xerox or whatever. He's writing by hand. It is a handwritten copy, not something mechanically produced. If it's mechanically produced, it's going to be virtually in error and impeccable. But it involves a handwritten copy. Secondly, there are a lot of them. You'll notice that you say, well, how many actual manuscripts of the New Testament are there? About 5,700. Around 5,700. But thirdly, let me note that they're not all complete. They're not all complete. Most are simply fragments. You've got here an example. This is a fragment of the Gospel of Luke, the 11th and 13th chapter. This is in the Chester Beatty Library, I think it's in Dublin, Ireland. It's known as P45. The P stands for papyrus, as opposed to some other material, and it dates around AD 250. Very old piece. But you'll notice it's very incomplete. It's only partially present. Most of the 5,700 manuscripts we possess of the New Testament are simply partial. They're simply fragments, but each testifies to the existence of an independent document, an individual document. Each of these testifies to the existence of an individual document. Fourthly, and let me go back and point out one other thing here, B. This is the one I mentioned just a moment ago that people say it's no larger than a credit card. If you put that down, it'd be no larger than this. It's very small. P52, the John Rollins Papyrus in the Rollins Library in the University of Manchester, Northern England. It is a fragment of the Gospel of John, the 18th chapter, found in Egypt. Very old, but only a fragment. And that's the thing you need to understand. We're not talking about when we say 5,700 manuscripts. We've got 5,700 complete manuscripts of the New Testament, or even of a single book necessarily. Fourthly, in terms of the distribution of these manuscripts, while manuscripts range from the mid-2nd to the 16th century, the majority are of a relatively late date, most coming from the 11th to the 14th century. You can see this on the graphic here. And you got the number here, the year up here. This is the number. This is the century here, up to the 10th century, 11th to the 15th, 16th century. These are the numbers. You see the vast majority of these are late in time. The best date back to about AD 350. The two most important being Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Codex Sinaiticus is located in the British Museum in London, Codex Vaticanus in the Vatican Library in Rome. This is Codex Sinaiticus. Again, it is the oldest complete manuscript of the New Testament we possess. Discovered in 1859. Codex Vaticanus, again, this is the ending of the Gospel of Luke, beginning of the Gospel of John on the same page. Very, very old. Here's Alexander. The third would be Codex Alexandrinus. You've got a scholar here working in the preservation and the conservation of that. But this dates to the 5th century. It is another very, very old manuscript. In addition to their being spread over a large span of time, from the 2nd century to about the 16th century, manuscripts of the Greek New Testament also represent a geographic diversity, typically being grouped or classified according to family types. Here would be another graphic that gives you a picture. Again, you've got the centuries going up to the 15th century. You've got three large families, maybe four, some would say, but three basic families. This would be the incense for the majority text, simply because you see the black and darkened areas, that represents the number of those. This is the Textus Receptus, by the way, that the King James is based on. But the vast bulk of these comes later in time, beginning about the 10th, going to about the 15th century. There's another group over here known as the Alexandrian text that is the oldest that we possess. And then you got the Western text that would have been based in Rome and in maybe Gaul, places like that. Alexandria would be North Africa. This would have been an Eastern text in Constantinople. And it would have been, again, the later text here. You'll notice that the Western text kind of seemed to be very small in number. They seem to have disappeared after about the 5th or 6th century. Why? Very simply because of the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate. Jerome, in what the 4th or 5th century, translated the New Testament from Greek into Latin. That became the standard text for the church in the West. And so in the West, it's simply, basically, the Greek text came out of use. They used Latin from that point on. You'll notice a change here relative to that, and this has to do with the Muslim expansion. As Islam expanded beyond the Arabian Peninsula, the Christian church began to shrink, and their influence began to shrink, and so you see the diminished use of the New Testament here, as opposed to in the East, where Islam did not really take hold until much later on. It predominated at a later date. That would be the Byzantine text. Now, as to their historic significance, again, bear with me, I'm struggling with my voice. The significance it can be portrayed or communicated or given expression by use of a chart. The chart I'm going to use was prepared by F.F. Bruce, a professor of of Antiquities at the University of Manchester in England. This is what his chart looks like. I don't know whether you can actually read any of the names on the graphics. The first column, though, is the author. These are the people that actually wrote in antiquity. Caesar, who described his own invasions as he went north into Gaul. Plato, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Thucydides, Suetonius, Herodotus, Euripides, Demosthenes, Aristotle. Again, important historians. The second column records when they actually wrote their works. Caesar in the 1st century BC, Plato about 300 to 400 years before Christ, Tacitus about 100 years after Christ, Suetonius again in the 1st and 2nd century AD after Christ, Herodotus wrote in the 5th century before Christ, Aristotle wrote in the 4th century before Christ as well. The third column relates, what do we actually have? What do we possess in terms of actual manuscripts of these ancient writers? That's who wrote it. That's when they wrote it. These are the earliest copies that we possess of Plato, who wrote in the 3rd and 4th century BC. The earliest copies we have date to AD 900. For Tacitus, who wrote in the 1st century AD, around AD 100, the earliest copies we have date to 1100 AD. For Suetonius, again in the 1st century AD, 950 AD. For Herodotus, who wrote in the 3rd and 4th century BC, the earliest manuscript we have of his writings, and you all know about the Greeks and the Persians and the wars and so forth, the earliest manuscript we have of that is 900 AD. Well, the next question would be, how big a time span is that? Well, you notice that for Plato, there's a gap of 1,200 years. With Tacitus and his history, 1,100 years. For Suetonius, 800 years. For Herodotus, 1,300 years. And we might ask, lastly, how many copies do we actually possess? We mentioned that we own something like, 5,700 copy or manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. For example, Caesar, in recording his military exploits, there are only 10 manuscripts we possess. Going down to Pliny the Younger, 7. Thucydides, 8. Suetonius, 8. Herodotus, 8 manuscripts. Euripides, 9. Demosthenes, there's a lot, over 200 of those. Aristotle, there are only something like 5 manuscripts. That's amazing. Again, you've got maybe 200 at most of these, but on average, maybe 8 or 10, maybe a dozen, with a time gap of 1,100 years, 1,300 years from the time that they were written until the earliest manuscripts that we possess. And yet nobody really questions, at least generally speaking, the historical data and information we receive from these people. We think we have a basically good idea about the Greeks and the Persians and their wars and the Romans and their expansion into the Gaul and Britain and that kind of thing based on these documents. What about Muhammad, by the way? What do we know about Muhammad? Well, we've got the Quran, but the Quran doesn't tell us about Muhammad. That comes from other sources, and I'm going to kind of look at this briefly. Muhammad lived in the 7th century, in the Christian era. The Hadith, which is the primary source of information about Muhammad, his life, his work, and so forth. Again, Sahih Bukhari, Imam Bukhari, who lived in the 9th century. It's a 200-year gap. 200 years between the time that Muhammad lived and the first Hadith began to be penned. Those collections began to come into being. In terms of the Syrian literature, Ibn Ishaq lived in the 8th century. And in terms of history, Al-Tabari, who lived also in the 9th and 10th century. You get a gap there. And yet nobody really questions what we think we know about Muhammad, about basically how his life unfolded and his marriage, Khadijah, and his the travels and